Hi guys, so this is going to be about the Cold War, as the title says. However, I'm going to try to put it in a nutshell, but trust me, well, you know me now. Well, it might be a bit long. Anyway, the Cold War. You have a rope domino setup, said President Eisenhower. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you see this drawing, this is basically what the Cold War is based on. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, the Viet Cong, the American soldier keeping it together. And this is what the whole system, the whole post-World War II system is based on. The fear that if one of the country will turn red, all the other ones will too. So basically, the Soviet Union occupied East Europe. This crucial result of World War II destroyed the Grand Alliance, gave birth to the Cold War. The US was not willing to accept Russian domination over Europe or even over the world. And Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister, said, "There is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, is that is fighting without them." So I'm not sure about this sentence or what it means, but I liked it because, well, Winston Churchill, when in his 1946 speech in, I think it was in Michigan, he explained that Europe was going to be divided into two and that an iron curtain was falling over. Well, this was like a prophecy because this is what happened like a year after that. And we all like Winston Churchill for many things, his cigars, his dog, or his bulldog face. But also, he was like always telling the truth about what would happen next. So, two ideologies, a divided Europe, some keywords, Europe Recovery Program, Iron Curtain, Marshall Plan, Zdanov Doctrine, coming from Warsaw Treaty, some key personalities, Stalin, Churchill, De Gaulle, George Marshall, Truman, Andrei Zhdanov. Um, I'm just going to be quick on something, and this something is that by 1946, Greece and Czechoslovakia were the only countries in Eastern Europe that were not communist. So on March 12, 1947, Harry Truman, the American president, told the world that every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. Sorry, the war had been over for the past 2 years, but Europe remained under pressure. Oh, this is a song. Anyway, now I have it in mind. So in June 1945, Secretary of State George Marshall explained in a speech his program to rebuild Europe. He outlined a program of economic assistance to wartime Europe, and the Marshall described the situation in Europe as being a near complete collapse. World War II had resulted in the destruction of Europe's cities. He proposed a bold plan that the US would lend the money, and more importantly, the former enemies of World War II would work together to rebuild Europe. The Soviets had been the first one to launch an attack on the Reich. They were entitled to the European reconstruction. The same year Truman landed his Truman Doctrine, it aimed at containing communism that was spread across Europe. So by definition, communism is a theory or system of social organization in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. It is opposed to capitalism, which is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Between privatization and nationalization, both countries wanted to restore Europe. As a response to the Marshall Plan, delegates from the communist parties of the Soviet Union, Poland, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and France gathered near Warsaw and created the Comintern in 1948. Andrei Zhdanov, Stalin's right-hand man, persuaded the participants in the constructive meeting to prove the doctrine according to which the world was now divided into two irreconcilable camps: an imperialist and anti-democratic camp led by the US and an anti-imperialist and democratic camp led by the USSR. This doctrine was the Soviet response to the Truman Doctrine. Zhdanov condemned imperialism and colonization, but advocated new democracy. Europe was on recovery, but Germany was at the center of interest. Two keywords here that I did not write was privatization and profit and nationalization. No, it was nationalization and privatization, yeah. Because when we've worked on the oil crisis, and it all started with that, with the fact that the US had a monopoly over things, and that to avoid all those problems, there was a switch and basically a stop, as they put a stop to the private ownership of some stuff. The soil crisis, the oil crisis, it's all about a wish to end privatization. So quickly, the case of Berlin. So I'll let you read the keywords. The Operation Vitals is one of the ones. The Iron Curtain, and of course the division. So you know about the Yalta Conference to divide Germany, and in July 45 there was the Potsdam Conference, and the USSR, the Western powers, started to disagree a lot, and Stalin wanted to permanently cripple Germany, whereas the other wanted to avoid repeating the same mistakes they did in Versailles. So Stalin tightened control of Eastern Europe, whereas Churchill, who wasn't the British Prime Minister anymore, started to worry about the possible Iron Curtain. And Berlin was situated in East Germany, but it was divided into four parts within the Soviet bloc. When East Germany refused the Marshall Plan, well, Stalin blocked all roads, railways, and canals linked to West Berlin. So for 11 months, the Soviets denied all Western goods to West Berlin. However, the US came up with a strategy of airlifting called Operation Battles. And every 2 minutes, a plane was leaving West Germany and delivering supply to West Berlin. Um, if the US had fought their way into Berlin, that would have led to a new war, so it would have been World War III. And by supplying Berlin by air, Truman showed an American superiority without using force. It was strategic. So in 1949, Stalin reopened the borders to avoid any further action from the Soviets in Europe. And well, Germany was split into the Federal Republic of Germany on the west side, and they launched their own money, the Dutch mark. And Stalin set up the German Democratic Republic the same year. It's important not to forget NATO at the time, okay, that was created in 1949. Let's focus now on the 50s. I love the 1950s. I gave you three pictures here. One of Joseph McCarthy. The little guy here is the famously known John Edgar Hoover, the guy who created the FBI in 1917 after the Espionage Act. I don't know. Yeah, I think I'm going to talk about it. Well, I'll see. So let's go back to 1919, after the Russian revolutions. So when communism first scared the whole world in 1919, after the Bolshevik revolutions, leaders did propaganda to boost public fears. And at the dawn of the Cold War, the same thing happened. There were two main causes for that red scare: the fear of spies, because the USSR launched the A-bomb in 1949, and rivalry between political parties. Once the Soviets had managed to create their own atomic bomb in 1949, Americans started to suspect US citizens to give information to the Soviets. The main crusader against communism was Senator John McCarthy. He was helped by the FBI, and he started to investigate every citizen with an uncertain background. So from 1947 to 1954, it was an era known as McCarthyism. Communism widely spread across the whole world, from Eastern Europe to China as well as Korea. Many countries started to subscribe to this ideology, fearing this communist gangrene. McCarthy and his fellow anti-Reds made multiple arrests on the simple basis of gossips and intimidations. Rumor had it that a secret FBI blacklist prevented anyone suspected of being associated with communism to get hired. Um, just a little party, known as the famous Hollywood 10. Famous screenwriters and directors of the late 40s were arrested and blacklisted until the end of the 60s. Some even went to prison. Another scandal came from the Rosenberg because, oops, uh, the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1951 led to their, well, they were killed. And both were accused of spying for the Soviets, and they were convicted and executed under the Espionage Act of 1917. Uh, the 50s started with the National Security Council issuing the NSC, for National Security Council 68, a treaty acknowledging the dangerous spreading of the Reds and the need to more aggressively contain it. Communism was gaining in Korea, and that was after it gained China. Eisenhower domino theory seemed in motion. Korea was already divided, and a war broke out between the South and the Communist North. The war lasted 3 years, and in the end, the border was still based on the 38th parallel. So from 1950 to 1953, Truman was willing to negotiate, but did not want to do any concessions. The 1952 election led Dwight Eisenhower to the White House, who was more willing to end the war. Uh, Still in the 50s, the CIA played an important role in the 1950s. Anyway, in 1954, Dwight Eisenhower gave a historic speech on the so-called domino theory. That was the quote I gave you at the beginning. And when he was elected in 53, U.S. foreign policy changed. He appointed two brothers, one as the head of the CIA and the other one as the Secretary of Defense. Those were the Dulles brothers. John Dulles as a Secretary of Defense, and his brother Alan Dulles as the head of the CIA. Eisenhower chose to be more offensive in his approach of the Cold War. Well, the guy was a general, something like that. Um, so as Stalin died in 1953, or maybe 54, I think it was 53, Khrushchev became the new Soviet leader. And Eisenhower's had an idea of policy. It was the new look. And it was different from the Truman Doctrine. As Truman wanted to avoid combat just after the end of the Second World War, his successor knew that a new war would be a nuclear one. Knowing this threat, he used Allen Dulles and different covert operations as an alternative to combat. Created in 1947, the CIA aimed at collecting foreign intelligence. The most famous CIA covert operation was led in Iran, and I already talked about it. And the CIA had helped a coup to reassure the British who owned the oil pits in Iran, and they negotiated half of the supply needed. To complete his first interaction with the Middle East, Eisenhower passed his own doctrine in 1957 and he promised to provide economic and military assistance to the countries of American oil interests in the Middle East. The second and unsuccessful CIA covert operation was in Cuba, but that time it was led by JFK, who ordered the operation. It happened on the year of his election, 1961, and Cuba was a strategic point for the Soviets as Castro swore allegiance to the USSR. Remember, 1959, Batista was overthrown by Fidel Castro, and Batista was allied with the US, and Castro was allied with the USSR, and well, Cuba was under threat in itself. However, Kennedy decided to launch the Bay of Pigs, and it was a CIA covert operation targeting Castro government. The operation failed because of the lack of support of the Americans toward Cuban revolts. And seeing America's fear of Cuba, it was important for the Soviets to support financially and military Cuba. So basically, Kennedy thought they were, well, he knew because of the spying that there was some big missiles on Cuban soil, and he did this. So the U.S. put their own on in Turkey, the Dardanelles crisis and everything that would aim directly to Moscow if in case of an attack. Well, they just like that's when they created the red phone and they could talk it over like you take your missiles out of Turkey, I take my missiles out of Cuba, and like this we avoid a third world war. So Cuba and the New Frontier. Just quickly, I don't know if it's quick, because in my head it isn't. So Cuba is an island not far from the coast of Florida. You know that the U.S. was behind Batista. and Castro overthrew the government, entitled with Khrushchev. And October 14th, 1962, U.S. pilot took photos with the missiles. So that was basically what I was telling you. And the U.S. Placed a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent the USSR to deliver the military supplies. And they put some missiles in Turkey. And the New Frontier sent an important message to the USSR, because that's the thing. Because now I remember. Uh, the frontier is not only about Cuba and Turkey, it's also about the moon. The new frontier sent an important message to the USSR because the Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin in space and Sputnik, and Kennedy was like, man, we need to send somebody to the moon before the end of the decade. Well, they did, though Kennedy was dead. And his policy was called the New Frontier, and space was the limit. The space race was launched at that time, and Johnson followed Kennedy's path on social politics and foreign policy. So that's what was important. Here you can see two cartoons that I like. I will let you zoom in to see that in more details. So here I changed the view because I was like, maybe you would need more dates and see who was doing what when. Yeah, the monobrow guy is Brezhnev. I mean, the guy literally has monobrow. Anyhow, so after China got its own nuclear bomb, it was the beginning of the detente. Following years of growing strains between the US and the Soviet, the two superpowers engaged in an era of detente diplomacy from 69 to 79. Um, Nixon and Ford and Brezhnev marked a decade of improved relations between the nations, and increase in trade, and the negotiation was and signing the key nuclear arms treaties. Um, so early arms accord agreements, including the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty and the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, helped set to the ground for future detente agreements started in 67 between Johnson and Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin. Okay, that's when they signed SALT number one. Uh, the agreement limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles either side could have in their arsenals, and allowed each nation to build two missile defense sites, only two. Anyway, in 75, the Helsinki Final Act followed. It was signed by 34 nations at the Conference on Security, and I lost my train of thought. Yeah, I remember. And it was the beginning of cooperation in Europe. So it mainly focused not only on military issues and defining political borders, but also advanced the opportunities for increased trade and scientific cooperation, and promoted cultural exchanges, human rights, and freedom of the press. So basically, the Ditton had for goal to promote globalization and an agree to disagree consensus. Countries agreed that they could benefit from one another regarding the arms race and any other kind of race, but in the end, it was slowing down before a greater jump. The war in Vietnam was devastating for the US population at a time when recession struck, oil prices, and the fact that they literally lost in Vietnam. So I really like this little cartoon of the USSR dancing with the US, because you can see that they seem in sync, though, well, they're not. That's very interesting. And afterwards, when Jimmy Carter lost the presidency, things changed. And at that time, it was the beginning of the Second Cold War between 1979 and 1985, which was characterized by the multiplication of the regional conflicts, Soviet expansionism, and the restart of the arms race. So such policies highlight the back to Cold War. The well, let me rephrase that. So, um, but by the end of the 1970s, the U.S. forces, that they invaded Afghanistan, and the Middle East was very strategic. We saw that already. The U.S. was in favor not only of Pakistan and things like that, but the US were actually providing weapons to the Afghan people. So, to be clear, after years of negotiations between Carter and Brezhnev and Carter and other guys, SALT II was signed in 79, which established an equal number of nuclear weapons between the countries and limited the missiles, among other guidelines. I don't know the details. The thing is that in 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led Carter to delay ratifying SALT number 2. With the continued armed talks stalled and the tensions between the US and the Soviets rising following the invasion, the Dayton era was deteriorating. So while this invasion continued, other nations of the world could not conduct business as usual with the Soviet Union. And Carter said that during his State of Union address, announcing stiff economic penalties on the Soviet Union, a ban on permits for Soviet ships to fish in US coastal waters, the cutting off of access to high-tech and agricultural products, and other trade limitations. And of course, he said another thing like, and I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow. And Carter's support of Afghan and Pakistani troops and America's boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, followed by the election of Reagan, who referred to detente as a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its aim, and in 1983 called the nation an evil empire. Well, it ended the Dayton era and escalated the Cold War once again. One bro man died in 1982. No, important. I added Thatcher because I think that Thatcher was an important player because with Reagan, she installed a new special relationship. I will let you dig into that. But Thatcher and Reagan had many common goals and common ideas and common stuff. And well, the thing is that Britain was hit hard in 1979. It was called the winter discontent, and that's when there were the great strikes and everything. So the country was getting poorer and poorer, and inflation was very high, and the miners were on strike, and so people could not really heat their homes and everything. So, well, Thatcher and Reagan were in that together. So let's focus on the last part. In a nutshell, the Second Cold War was ushered in by the election of Reagan as a U.S. president in November 1980. So while it renewed fears of nuclear war and annihilation, the Second Cold War ultimately brought about reforms in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War in itself. In November 1980, Carter was replaced by Reagan, an actor turned politician who had served 2 terms as the Republican governor of California. Reagan was known for his bellicose anti-communism. Reagan declared his determination to roll back communism instead of choosing to coexist with or tolerate it. He found a strong-minded ally in newly elected British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Both resolved to confront Soviet communism directly and bring the Cold War to a conclusion. The USSR during this period was still led by Brezhnev, Monobro, and Nikita Khrushchev, his successor, and one of the architects of the detente. Brezhnev was very poor by the late 70s, however, and he played a way smaller role in policy and decision making. So the question is, why did Reagan reignite the Cold War by increasing defense spending and provoking the Soviet Union? Some of Reagan's critiques on the left attributed his actions to his thoughtless antipathy to communism. Others saw Reagan as a Christian evangelical warmonger who thought confrontation with the USSR, well, he was like willing to confront them and win because he was strong. In reality, there was more purpose and planning behind Reagan's ideas. Perhaps the best evidence of these can be found in the National Security Decision Directive 75, a policy directive issued by Reagan in 83. More than any other single document, this one outlines how the Reagan administration planned to win the Cold War. The US, it said, would compete with the Soviet Union militarily, and I'm opening the quotation mark, to contain and overtime reverse Soviet expansionism. So basically, Reagan and his advisors understood that the Soviet economy was stagnant and in need of reform and on the verge of significant change, if not on the verge of collapse. Reagan aimed to pressure the USSR to speed up the process of change towards a more pluralistic political and economic system. So reviving the arms race, for example, would place an additional economic strain on Moscow. Um, Here you got a picture of Gorbachev, and here you've got the little Star Wars hint, uh, because, well, it's the evil empire. So I will talk about pop culture a bit later on. 1989, the Berlin Wall opened. Um, that was very important. Anyway, people were deflating from one side to the other anyway, but still, this happened for real. Uh, well, we often see Reagan as only an actor turned politician, is Schwarzenegger or Trump. However, Reagan was very smart in his choices, and the idea of playing the on the ego, because that's the thing, he played on the ego of the USSR to win, because well, you were not born, but there was the nuclear the I was not born either, just to say. There was the nuclear plantation of Chernobyl that exploded in '86, and that was beginning of the end, because there was a cover up and people knew, and well, things went south at that time. And the U.S. at the same time gave money and weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan and opened their way from Pakistani refugee to come to America. So many things happened, and the U.S. were like um, richer and wealthier, because, well, they cut down domestic expenses and slowed down the welfare state, and the USSR could not follow. So by playing on their ego, they had to come up with new ideas, and finally they lost. I'm not going to get into that. If you want any ideas, I'll let you read it. So you can just press stop and read. Um, because that too, this is from the poll point from your teacher. It's interesting to know that this was the end. And I had a bad joke, like close your eyes and count down, not from 10, but from 1947. And you can still see the premises of the Ukrainian war on this map. Everything is kind of linked because, well, as you can see, uh, Ukraine was still part of the US, was part of the USSR, and the country is like 30 years old, so basically older than the country of Ukraine. And the USSR has always thought it was part of them because they had a common language, common culture. But this started in 19, well, I don't know when it came into the USSR, but the Soviets or whatever. The thing is that the Soviets were an empire, and that's why the Star Wars metaphor is very accurate. Uh, and the empire started to want to expand. Well, it did not end well, and today they are still willing to expand the country, well, the empire, but, well, it's all in the past, and now as there is globalization, and we can talk about the Americanization of the world. Uh, this is still very complex to understand, but each country has its own culture and its own heritage. And when you build an empire, you want to build a common identity. But by creating a common identity, you take out some of the identity of the other. And this is why the war in Ukraine nowadays is so important, because let's remember that I think it was in 2013, 2014, that Putin already invaded Crimea. Well, it's as if France was taking Belgium, Luxembourg, and I know Liechtenstein, nobody know where that is, but still. And it was like, oh, they speak French, or kind of speak French. This is part of the French Empire. So that's basically what Russia did in the past, and what they kept on trying to do. Little party on Cold War in pop culture, because this is my favorite thing. Um, you can see 007, of course, James Bond, Ian Fleming's novel. And not fun fact, Ian Fleming was actually a spy during World War II, and James Bond is based on his real life. And James Bond versus Doctor No came out before before the Bay of Pigs debacle, and it's very funny because it was actually about nuclear war. So it basically was like prophecy. I put an Iron Man picture because Iron Man was created in 1963, and it was soft power from the US to develop the idea that the US was stronger regarding the arm race and science. The Hulk came out about the same time in the 60s, 70s, don't really remember, and it was about the nuclear warfare, because you know that Bruce Banner turns Hulk because of a nuclear explosion, so it was to show that the US was stronger. Of course, Captain America, you've all seen the Winter Soldier, and if you haven't seen it yet, well, this is homework, guys. You have to watch it. And Captain America is like, it's not only American propaganda, it's more than that. I mean, here it's like striking back the Soviets, and we've seen during World War II, it was I putting the hit in Hitler. So soft power, because it plays in children's minds, and children's turn adults, turns warriors, and have children, and they basically, well, it's all soft power propaganda thing. um this picture in the middle is interesting because you see Hollywood. So what role has Hollywood played in the soft power of the American soft power? You see the rockets with the moon landing. You see Russia, the faces of some of them. You see Stalin, and you see that the map of the world is in the background, just like, is it like a board game or something like that? So this image is so interesting, and if you want to understand the Cold War, I wanted to put an extract of Rocky Four when Sylvester Stalin, uh, well, he beats the Russian Drago, and well, this is America. This is how they show their strength, culture. So sorry it was long, but I mean I had to cover like half a century of war, of ideological war, political war, strategic. So sorry, guys. Hope it helped. Bye.